You're listening to Witch Wednesdays, your weekly podcast source for all things witchcraft in the modern world. Welcome back to Witch Wednesdays. This is Steph, and I have a very fun episode for you today featuring a special guest. So I am going to hand it over to her now so she can introduce herself and tell you where you can find her online.
Hello, and thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited as somebody who has listened to basically all of your archives. I am super excited to be part of this. So thank you so much. My name is Lauren. I am the host of Beyond the Veil podcast, where I basically discuss all things death related, whether it's from a spiritual lens, historical, a little bit of pop culture in there too. Its main goal is to really get close to death acceptance, questioning our death avoidant society, and the things we can do, whether it's learning new knowledge, gaining a better understanding of ourselves, participating, engaging with some spiritual work that gets us closer to accepting what is so natural: rebirth, life, death. It's all really one thing. So that is the main goal of my podcast and my project. And I also have an Instagram for that too, where folks can also see the more visual sides of my projects and my work. And that is at Beyond the Veil _podcast on Instagram.
All right, thank you. And as always, I will have everything linked over at witchwednesdays.com so you can find all of this and all the podcasts very easily. So the first thing that I really sort of wanted to ask you and get into is, how did you get to the point that you're at in working, with death, with such a topic that, as much as death is shrouded in mystery and people don't want to talk about. So how did you get there within your own spiritual practice and history and settle on that as a topic for your podcast?
Yes. Yeah, it is I like that you mentioned it as like a mystery. That's, I think, something that writers and philosophers and thinkers and scientists have always been fascinated by. And yet today, societies are largely pretty afraid of talking about it, and they go to some great lengths to avoid it. As I also feel like in my own personal life, it very much parallels that. And so for me, I think my initiation into death work has been kind of a convergence of many roads and paths, whether it was like initiation by pandemic or breakup or a death of a loved one. There's been multiple roads, I think, that have led me to this project that has taken me some time to figure out over the years that this is what I wanted. I think I always knew I wanted to embark on a project like this. It just took many converging factors to have me consciously realize this. And one of the biggest ones was the death of my father when I was pretty young. It was very abrupt. I was 18 years old, had just had my first year of college, coming back that next summer, and my life totally changed. And it has taken me quite a bit of time to become comfortable with that reality in my life, and with the onslaught of the pandemic that really had a lot of people questioning the things that they had been avoiding for quite some time and really doing some internal work. For me, that was very similar and led me down this road, having already been immersed in the more magical side of things. And as like a historian in my professional life, this project really is all my favorite things. It's feeling deeply about death and addressing grief, which is so personal yet so universal at the same time, and being able to try to understand society's perspectives on death, and also engaging with like the death archetype too, because for me, I've also noticed that the way I experience my grief and my feelings of loss when it comes to the people who've passed over in my life, it also impacts the way I navigate change in moments of great fluctuation in my life. So becoming very good friends with the death archetype too, and using magical elements to embark on that journey has made me feel so much more connected to the larger universal experience of life, death, and rebirth. So it's a big journey, and I'm enjoying being able to connect with other people on this because it's so universal of a topic.
It is. And it's really interesting that you bring up the death archetype, because everyone is kind of scared of that tarot card when it comes up, that they see the death tarot card and they think that they're going to die or a loved one is going to die, but it really is about change and rebirth. So it's really interesting that you talk about that archetype in association with the big monumental changes in your life, because that's really, a part of the death aspect as well. When you have those big shifts in your life, there is something that dies with that. There is a part of you, of your old self, that dies when you have these monumental changes. And that comes up a lot in tarot. I know people are terrified of that card.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's such a good point. And I think we are terrified of change in similar ways that we're terrified of death and loss, with very good reason. But the more I do this internal work and I feel more connected in my spiritual practices, incorporating death work within that sphere, it makes, in an unexpected way, you much more acceptant of what you can't control. And that is like my main goal, because that's how my grief has manifested, in really wanting to control situations and outcomes and feeling a lot of distress when I can't, because there's only so much you can control with your life. And so it may not seem very spiritual for an outsider to think like working with death is a magical practice. But when you're choosing to actively see life through the lens of death, you are forever changing, and you're kind of accessing a level of awareness about the world around you that's of the natural worlds. And I don't think we really associate death with nature. It's mostly just like springtime, blooming, flowers, planting seeds. This is the more shadowy side of nature. But like, I can't even walk outside and take a walk in my neighborhood without acknowledging and noticing the trees are dropping leaves that I'm crunching on, and they are death. Or I'm putting away my lunch boxes after a day of work, and I'm noticing like the food in there is going through its process of decay. So on a daily basis, I'm feeling connected to something larger than myself, which is something I really wanted, is to feel like I am a part of something. And the disconnection in my professional and personal life has really been able to be eroded, because I realize change isn't scary, and it is something that through working with it, you kind of gain an appreciation for it. It makes things far less scarier when they become things you are seeing on a daily basis.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I understand, where you're coming from. I have talked about this on the podcast before, but my dad passed away in November of 2020. And that was the first like very close person to me that had passed away. And I think it's really interesting in how my reactions then shifted, and how I deal with grief shifted. Like, I suddenly feel like so comfortable in graveyards. That never happened to me before. It wasn't someplace that I ever, wanted to spend time. I didn't want to like sit and think about it for a long time. It was really the avoidance that you mentioned. It was just a topic, a place in particular, that I didn't want to spend a lot of time. And now I love graveyards. There's like a sense of peace there. And having lost someone, it really, I understand about not avoiding it, which I think, people have very different reactions to grief. So you absolutely could go the other way and avoid it as much as possible. But I think a great way to deal with your grief is really that acceptance and looking into it more, which is what makes your podcast so interesting.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah. And thank you for sharing that with all of us, because I know it's very personal, as anybody who's experienced great loss like that from somebody in an immediate family. I was actually re-listening to some of my favorite episodes of yours that you've released, and unsurprisingly, they're all about the ones like with death. So I was listening to the one about ancestor work, and you'd mentioned the passing of your father too. And I think it is such a great way to engage when you are trying to develop just more death positivity and connecting with those who have passed, like being able to do that through like natural or naturally informed, like spiritual elements. It is so healing to have that connection. That was one of the biggest things for me to realize. It dawned on me, my relationship with this person doesn't have to end because they physically are no longer here. And that energy, that love, their desire to care for me and support me and me to learn from them doesn't just dissipate. It's, I don't know, I always think about like this idea of like atoms, like they don't just like go away and they can't just dissolve. There's this energy that just can't leave, in my personal opinion, that like always surrounds us when there's that deep connection. So knowing that I can continue that relationship with them is so incredibly healing at the end of the day, regardless of whether or not larger society recognizes that. To me, I think it's a very radical act challenging our death avoidance society by refusing to conform to what maybe other people expect somebody to be in their grief. It's a lifelong thing you carry. There's no way to fully heal grief because, you know, you'll always love that person. And when they're gone, the love turns to grief and you'll always love them. So you'll always be grieving. But like you said, with the graveyards and being able to be in that space and walk through and feel like you've been connected deeply to the spirit worlds is so powerful. As much as we don't really want to be initiated into that, I think we have wisdom in ways that other people who haven't experienced that won't have access to, but eventually will, because we all die someday.
Very true. So with your, podcast, but also your spirituality and your practice, of course, there's going to be no typical day. You don't have a loved one dying every day, thank God. But what is it that you do in your practice semi-regularly associated with death work? What are some of the things that you do?
Yeah, it's a heavy topic. That's why I really only release one episode a month, because it is a heavy emotional labor load to add into my day. I'm a public school educator during the work week, and that is very emotionally taxing itself.
That's enough of a load right there.
Yes, yeah. So I initially created the podcast itself because I wanted to center death in my life, have it be an active part of my lifestyle, because it's not convenient to be addressing these emotions, my feelings of loss and grief, and what manifests because of those experiences. So it is challenging, but for me, it is always centering around the episodes that I release. There's always some type of journal prompt element that I come up with, or an exercise that is a connection to either very directly or maybe less direct, in association with a theme of whatever that episode is for that month. So for example, I'm going to be discussing in my upcoming episode the topic of death positivity. What is it, and how does that become an active part of your lifestyle? And the exercise that corresponds to that for me for that month is visiting my father's gravesite, going and parking outside of the graveyard, interacting with the protective spirits that are guarding the graveyard, walking through, just being super present and doing a graveyard meditation I read in the book Light Magic for Dark Times, and then making my way over to his gravesite and just being like super present around death. So it's little things like that that get my creativity going, because I think, what do I need to address? Like, where am I feeling I want to explore more of? And I kind of document that through my Instagram account and the episode itself. And in general, when I do any kind of magical workings, I am trying to provide opportunities for my ancestors and the recently deceased people in my life to be a part of that process, just like I would come to them if they were still physically alive today and ask them for wisdom or advice on an issue I'm experiencing in my personal or professional life. I'm kind of paralleling and mimicking that in more of my spiritual workings, which is super healing to know that I don't have to miss out on that opportunity because they're no longer physically here. So it's a lot of including them in my spiritual work. And I also, as you've touched on this podcast, so I won't go into it in too much detail, I do have an ancestor altar that I am adding death iconography to that serves as my memento mori. So it's those reminders that someday we will all die. That's like a coffin shaped candle, for example. I have Samantha West's coffin shaped macabre tarot deck I really love. I have pictures of my deceased loved ones, flowers, offerings to them when I feel compelled. So it's lighting a candle for them at the end of my day, giving them like a few bits of rundown of my week, always kind of keeping that relationship going. Those are kind of the ways I keep death at the center of my life in a way that's very life-giving and not depleting.
The macabre tarot deck is on my current wish list. I am trying not to buy anything this year. I'm like working really hard at it. Like, what are my, New Year's resolutions? And witchcraft supplies are at the top of the list of things I do not need to be buying this year, but that one is on my wish list. I have a running wish list that I give to my husband and family members so they know what to get me, and that is like top of the list. So hopefully I will have that. But it really is like, it looks so beautiful from everything that I've seen. It looks so pretty and interesting. And again, I think since my father passed away, I'm like much more accepting of death and death sort of related imagery. So skulls and the coffins and things like that. I'm like much better about having those things around. I feel, much more of a sense of peace with those things now than I previously did. Whereas I wouldn't have considered them decor outside of the Samhain season. And now they're up like all year round. So I am going to set up an ancestor altar. So I might have to touch base with you before I do that. We are currently under construction at my house, but once that is finally done, if that is ever done, I will have a nice, desk area and bookshelf, and I'll be able to set up my ancestor altar. So I might have to reach out to you for some tips and things and get some ideas and see what yours looks like.
Oh, yes. Yeah, that's going to be, I think, a beautiful experience for you. Have you read Mallory Voudois' book titled Honoring Your Ancestors? Because that would be like a great resource for that. Like, that's been a wealth of knowledge for me.
I have not read that one yet, but it is also on my to be read list, and I requested it. My library does not have it in stock, but I put in the request for it. I was like, this is a great book. You should get it on your list so I can borrow it. So that one is on my list. I have heard of that one before.
Yes, super, super great resource. And to your Samhain comment, I feel like my work is very much like Samhain all year. And I think that's like one of my favorite like Sabbats, like on the wheel of the year. So I think it's a good way of summarizing what I do would be like, it's literally Samhain, like 24/7, that energy that I work with. So it's like thinking through that lens, like, rosemary can be used for so many things, but also it's really great for divination and connecting with the deceased, or looking at like uses for items that are really connected to ancestor work. It's like that wood, I'm forgetting the name of it, but it's like wood that is like, petrified wood. Yeah, that is really great to have on your altar too, to kind of like connect with that ancestral energy. So it's just taking what you would normally do with your magical crafting in your work and putting more of like that death energy spin on things. I find that to be very enjoyable. And I guess that's kind of like my niche when it comes to like my work, but I find it very healing because it's a great way to keep that physically there in your life in ways that like would be way more convenient to like not address these things. But I think it leads to more acceptance down the road.
So if somebody is listening to this podcast and they are, resonating with it and feeling like maybe they want to sort of tap into this, maybe study a little bit more, or just bring the idea of death more to the forefront in their lives, what would be some first steps that you would recommend if this is a completely new subject for them?
If they're listening to you, then clearly they've likely already listened to your ancestor work episode. And I think you also have an episode on graveyard magic. Am I mistaken?
I do.
Yeah. So I would think they should check those out because I think those are really good primers on entry points, because we should start by thinking about those who've come before us and how that energy could help us navigate our lives today. And also with visiting like those spaces of death too. They're accessible to anybody, whether you have somebody who's in those spaces. You could visit a graveyard and research best ways of approaching those spaces, having like the proper etiquette, and just thinking about like, how does death in the variety of forms it can show up? What does that look like in our lives? I don't have like this like perfect like answer for this. I think it's like a messy topic. And so it depends on like what our relationship is to death and what we are dealing with in our grief. So just kind of coming closer to the touch points that might be a bit more sensitive when we feel ready for that, because my father's hasn't been alive for like a decade at this point. So my relationship to him is going to be very different than somebody who has recently just lost a loved one. So I approach things in a different way because I have like a decade of grieving behind me. So it'll look different for every person, especially if they don't have anybody in their life who has passed away. Our relationships to death are so personal. So figuring out what it looks like to them is, I think, a really good first step, because that'll kind of have you first thinking about death. And I think we do a great job in our society of not thinking about it. So just thinking about it, I think, is a really great start.
Do you have any, this just reminded me because I have something over on Patreon that is like a little grief mojo bag that is really great for funerals and for sharing with people that you're attending a funeral and their loved one has passed and you just want to be supportive for them. Do you have anything that you would recommend for that? So maybe somebody is not dealing with their own grief at the moment, but they're wondering how that they can best support a friend when they are attending a wake, a funeral, or supporting them in the, time after, their loved one has passed away. Because I have to say that I very much know all of my friends who were there and supported me after my father passed and everything that they did for me. Like, I will never forget those things and those people. So do you have anything that you recommend others do for their friends and family members who are going through a hard time?
That mojo bag sounds amazing and like super useful. I think that having that physical presence is crucial. I think the act of doing things for the person that may be very challenging for them, thinking about the ways in which they might need to be supported at that time, like providing food possibly, or helping in the assistance of their the planning that might have to be a part of like their services for the loved one who was deceased. I would highly recommend, and what really helped me was just to know that people were there carrying that pain for me, whether it was their significant others volunteering to be pallbearers, them being at these places, their physical presence. Like, to me, that is the emotion that I always remember. I always think back that those were the people that wanted to literally like bear that pain with me and be on that journey with me. So for me, it's like that physical presence, being there, being in that moment, because funerals and graveyards, cemeteries, they're very uncomfortable places for all of us to be. It's not like a birthday or an anniversary where it's super celebratory, as much as we do love to celebrate life. So knowing that people are also facing the complexity, the messiness, the heaviness of death right next to me, that is, I think, the most beautiful and powerful ritual and spell somebody could offer me in that time of need personally.
I agree. That's a great way of looking at it. Doesn't always matter what you say, it matters what you do. So before we end and wrap up, I would like to ask you the question that I always ask my guests is, what advice do you have for a complete beginner? Because that's, a lot of the listeners for this podcast are complete beginners. So whether that is advice for beginners to the sort of death work that you do, or beginners to spirituality and witchcraft in general, what is some advice that you would give to a newbie?
I would definitely advise consuming any and all things death work, understanding like key terms. Like I would search in the beginning of my journey for like death witch or like death magic, things like that, that give me the information I need about how to spiritually work with death. Books like Danielle Dion's Magical Mediumship are just beautifully connecting what you probably would already know about the spiritual world with more of like the death side of things. As I mentioned, Mallory Voudoir's Honoring Your Ancestors is a great place to start too. Kate Froiler's Of Blood and Bones talks a little bit more about like working with more darker elements that typically are seen as dark magic. And so she, like you have done yourself on previous podcasts, challenges this notion of dark magic as being kind of a moot point when it comes to the overall general ways that we embark and engage in our spiritual practices. Becoming very familiar with the lunar cycles and how that mimics life, death, rebirth. That has been really a lovely starting point for me. In the beginning, channeling that natural cycle is helping me recondition myself to be less afraid of when those death, rebirth, life processes happen for me, knowing that it is just another turnaround, the spin around the sun, so to speak, spin around the moon. And I think also, again, getting clear on things like plants, and any kind of botanical or herb. They also have a lot to teach us about the life, death, rebirth process. So looking into people like Morning Light Divination, their Instagram account has a lot of really great resources on seeing how plant allies can be useful to folks when they're trying to engage in death work or the grieving process. I've done a lot of their online courses that I have found like a wealth of knowledge in engaging with. So hopefully that's a really great start for folks. And again, looking at your past podcast episodes is also a treasure trove of information too.
Oh, thank you. And I will have in the notes over on Witch Wednesdays all of the great books that Lauren has just mentioned to make it easier for you to find all of those, because I know that it can be tough to take notes while you're listening to this. So I will have those all listed for you.
I really like reading. So it's a lot of books. I love podcasts, a lot of podcast stuff. So I'm a total book nerd. So that's why I have so many recommendations.
Oh, me too. I have so many book recommendation episodes, period, on the podcast, just because I have so many different things to recommend. But the last thing, thought that was going to be the last question, but I just thought of this because it's not a question that I usually ask people, but maybe you have given it more thought than other guests. Do you have an opinion on the afterlife, of what happens after death? Have you considered that, thought about it? Because I'm getting more comfortable with death, but I still don't have a real opinion on what happens in the afterlife. It's something I haven't formed for myself. So I'm curious if you have one.
That is so funny you asked that, because that's actually going to be in the near future, an episode I really want to get into on my podcast.
Ooh, yay.
Yeah. So I think it's like the idea that you would bring that up just makes it more clear and obvious. Like this is an essential part of death work. I would love to approach it from like a cultural lens, historical aspect. And so where I'm at right now, because it's, I'm sure, always an ever evolving understanding. For myself, I feel like when somebody passes away, that the energy doesn't go away and it remains, because they kind of take the route that, you can't breakdown energy. Like there's always that rebirth that, bodies become, soil and nutrients for the plants and animal life and all of that. So as our physical bodies can't dissipate into nothingness, I think also the energy that animates individuals also doesn't disappear. It lingers, it hangs around. And so I don't think there is one place or one entry point, access point to the afterlife. I think of it as like energy, like light, I guess. It's like all around us. I think that they're always there with us, and they're always around and experiencing the world with us. And so that's kind of where I'm at, that there's no, even though I grew up Catholic, I don't really have this idea of like heaven or hell in my vantage point when it comes to the afterlife. I feel like it's all just one, just like life and death, it's all just one experience in and of itself. So I think we're always surrounded by it. And that brings me a lot of comfort. So whatever brings people comfort, I think is the right answer.
Yes, I think that there are so many answers to that question. And I think even if you ask Catholics who do believe in heaven and hell, even their answers aren't going to be the same. They're going to have different opinions of what that actually looks like. And for me, I just have not formed my opinion yet. I'm not really sure. I am also somebody who likes really concrete answers. And I like the scientific sides of a witchcraft practice. So for me, not ever knowing what that full answer is going to be until I actually die makes it hard for me in life to solidify what my answer might be, because I could be completely wrong and I hate being wrong. So I have not figured that out for myself, but I love hearing what others' answers are, because they are all, equally valid and interesting. And, I've given a little bit of thought on it, but I have not come to any sort of conclusion. So thank you for answering that. And I look forward to your episode on that topic. I think that will be really interesting to see, because I know it varies culturally, by religion. There's a lot of things that can influence what the answer to that question is. So excited to see what you come up with on that topic.
Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate you asking that, because it's like, I think a big part of death work is asking those kind of questions. So even as simple as that, maybe you aren't like going to a graveyard or embarking on ancestor work, but if you're thinking about what death means to you and what it looks like, that is just as valid as using graveyard dirt in your spell work.
Well, that is everything that I had to cover today. So thank you so much for being here. Again, I will have all of Lauren's information linked over at witchwednesdays.com, so you can find her easily and find her podcast. So you can reach out if you have any other questions, or maybe you have a specific topic you'd like her to cover on her podcast related to death in the future. I will have all those and all the books that she mentioned listed out for you. So thank you so much, Lauren. I greatly appreciate you being here. This was a fun topic. It seems weird to say that it was fun, but it actually was.
I know, I feel the same way all the time when I think about that. And as I always like to end my podcast with the quote from my favorite film, The Mummy, when I was growing up. The last thing that the reanimated mummy says as he goes back into his crypt in the water is, "Death is only the beginning." And I think that's so true. Like, death is only the beginning. We have the power to write the rest of the story. So I hope this helps people feel empowered. And I really thank you for making space for a heavy topic that I know personally touches you. So thank you for your emotional labor in this. I know it's heavy stuff for people to listen to. So thank you for being brave for anybody who is listening right now, because I know this is really hard, especially during the continuation of a pandemic. So thank you for your time. I really do appreciate that. And I love your podcast. So it's a total dream to be able to be on this. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate your kind words, and everybody who you listen to this episode. Yes, because you're absolutely right that it is a heavy topic, can be hard for a lot of people, but still a really important one. And your quote, and also that's your favorite movie, is just the greatest. I love that. So thank you again. And listeners, that is everything that I have for you this week, and I will see you next week.
Need even more? Subscribe to Patreon and YouTube for exclusive bonus content.
Order a themed witchcraft box every month through Witch Wednesdays on Etsy. Be sure to follow on Instagram at Witch Wednesdays Podcast. Find all these links and more at witchwednesdays.com.